Luke chapter 15. Marcia and I enjoyed our visit with Marcia's dad over this last week. I was very thankful that Chip DeWitt came and was able to share from the parable of the lost coin. And I've heard from some of you that you enjoyed that very much. I saw the beginning part of last week's sermon where he said how nice it was for Dan to give him the text from Melchizedek and then to offer up this parable of the lost coin. And I want to tell you that I did that because he is much smarter than I am. And I knew he would deal with those things in a deeper, more thorough way than I would. He's a bright, bright man. And I am thankful that he's able to come and be part of our conversation here. My wife's father has followed the Boston Red Sox for much of his life, living in New England. And every night we watched either the Boston Red Sox or Everyone Loves Raymond. If you've ever seen Everyone Loves Raymond, you know that that's an interesting satirical sitcom on the challenges of family. Well, if you follow baseball, Red Sox are a game and a half behind the Yankees in the American League East. And even though they lost, Red Sox lost twice to the White Sox, which was bad enough, but it stayed about even because the Yankees lost, and anytime the Yankees lost in New England, it's a wonderful time to celebrate. You know, lots of people are happy when the Yankees lose, so if you're a Yankee fan here, you're up still a half game, but it's going to be a long season. It's very similar to life here in the Triangle if you're rooting for Duke or Carolina or NC State and you lose or win. Winning means you're something, and losing means you're nothing. You know, that's the competitive spirit in sports sometimes. In our text today, we see loss again, but it's not ball game loss. It's not the loss on a field. It's not the loss of a deal. It's lost as in a disappearance. Something is gone. A couple of weeks ago, I had bought a garbage disposal for church. And I came in, I had set it out on Friday and looked at what needed to be put under the sink, and there were some pieces that were missing, and so I left it out on the sink top in here. And I came in on Sunday and I said to the ladies in the kitchen, "Have you seen the garbage disposal?" And they said, "No." Well, CCD had their first yard sale on Saturday. So I had this vision of my $100 garbage disposal having been swooped up and sold for $10. Still in the box, mind you. And I was afraid it was lost. And so I texted William, pastor of CDD, to say, "Hey, have you seen this garbage disposal?" And of course, it's radio silence. And then someone said, "Well, why don't you text James Hudson to see if he knows where it is?" So I texted James, and he says, "Oh yeah, I installed it." So it was no longer lost. I was happy that it was found. Yes, and I think the kitchen staff is also happy that it's installed. So there's lost as in you lost the game, but there's also lost as in something has disappeared. And in the parables that we see in Luke chapter 15, there are 3 different parables about this idea of things being lost. 3 disappearances. You remember the sheep wandered away, and we said that the Pharisees didn't, but the shepherd did. The Pharisees didn't care about the sheep, the people that were coming to Jesus, but the shepherd, Jesus, did. The sheep couldn't find their way back. They were lost. They had found this green patch of grass, and they found the next green patch of grass, and the next green patch of grass, and before long, they were just lost. They had just wandered away. And they couldn't find their way back. But the shepherd could. He could go find them, and he did. And when he found them, he came back, and there was this big party because what was lost was found. And then you have the coin. The coin fell off somehow. It was an important piece of jewelry. It was a memory. And somehow it had fallen. This piece of the jewelry fell off, and instead of it being complete, it was now broken. And it was not quality anymore. It was lost. And so it had to be someplace in the house. They seem accidental. The sheep wandering off, the coin falling off. But when we get to this middle of the chapter, verse 11, it seems like the boy, that was not an accident. See, there's a lot of room for grace in my world when things accidentally disappear. But when things walk away on their own, I find myself having a harder time. The boy who took his money and moved to the big city to meet girls, smoke some dope, drink a bit, live the good life according to the world's perspective, doesn't fit the image. Never mind the son who stayed home and felt justifiably angry when his lost brother came home and wasn't greeted with harsh consequence and reparation. 3 disappearances: the sheep, the coin, and the boy. But there are also 3 celebrations. Again, the sheep was found. Celebrate with us. The coin was found. Let's throw a party. This is complete now. And the boy came home. Let's celebrate that the boy that was dead is now alive again. We know he's safe. And it doesn't matter how it got lost, it only mattered that it was found. And the association that Jesus made was that this is how the heavens responded. They celebrated every time a sinner who humbly agrees they're going the wrong direction gets found. In chapter 15, verse 1 and 2, we read, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" So these 2 groups are the controlling parts of the story. And through these 3 parables, Jesus is teaching or trying to teach the Pharisees about how they ought to look at people. Less judgmental and more through the eyes of a gracious Jesus who invites all of us to come in from the cold, to stop being lost. So let's read the parable together, and then we'll talk about 4 different things. Starting in verse 11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.'" Now this was an offense. This was like saying, "I wish you were dead, Dad. You know, I'm going to take your money before you go, and I'm going to use it how I want." So it was not a very kind thing to do. "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he, the father, divided his property between them, between the 2 sons. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he possessed, all that he had, and set out for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. I'm not sure what wild is. Your wild may be different than my wild, may be different than John's wild, may be different than Caleb's wild, may be different than Jackie's wild. So I don't know exactly what wild looks like. But he went and he squandered his wealth in wild living. And after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him into his fields to feed pigs, which is kind of interesting. In Jewish context, the idea of feeding pigs, it doesn't really appeal. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And when he came to his senses, verse 17, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. I'm sure that took a lot of courage. I mean, you think about if you would have asked your father for half of your inheritance, basically wished him dead, and then took it and ran off and partied and broke every law that your household ever had, and then decided to come back. He may want you to come back with all of his heart, but you would not feel like it's a place you could go. I mean, how many runaways have run away and come to the conclusion that they can't go home because their parents are embarrassed, because their parents have these X, Y's, and Z's, when all their parents really want to know is, are you safe, and are you alive, and are things okay? He got up and went to his father. And almost you want to add parenthetically, not knowing quite what the outcome was going to be. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son and threw his arms around him and kissed him. I'm sure with tears and slobber and hysterics and just this welling up of uncontrollable sentiment. Verse 21, the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was out in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, what's going on? Your brother has come. And your father has killed the fattened calf because he is back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pled with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, and yet you never gave me even a young goat that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill a fattened calf for him? My son, the father said. Most likely with the same kind of tears and sentiment. My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. He's found. How can we not? The stories all trace back to the characters of the Pharisees and teachers of the law who complained that Jesus was too gracious and too merciful. Let's keep in mind these are all parables. They're not actual real situations. They're meant to teach spiritual truths. We can't paint them in clean boxes. In my past, as I've listened to people who tell sermons about this text, I almost get the feeling like I should lump myself in as the lost boy that has come back to the family, and how I'm not like the prodigal's brother, or I don't want to be at least. And so I draw these distinctions like I'm the good guy and the other people that are kind of, mean-spirited, they're the bad guys. I don't know. You read the story and he seems like in each one of these parables, he is talking specifically to the Pharisees and their attitudes of high and mightiness, where the people that Jesus most cares about are the sinners and tax collectors, not because they're better, but because they're willing to come with humility. But the Pharisees, they're sitting high and mighty in their world of, I got it together. And Jesus isn't so sure. As I pondered this passage and read through this week and last, a few things stood out to me, and I'd like to share those quickly. One is that God graciously and mercifully responds to humility. The story is about how God graciously and mercifully responds to humility. The text isn't about how someone gets saved. It isn't about who's part of the church and who's not. It's not really about the lost person. See how lost you are and come to the Father? All these stories, find the lost sheep, go look for the lost coin, embrace the lost son. It almost looks like it's about the church going after. But the context is that it's about Jesus going after the lost without regard to their response. He tells these stories to the arrogant Pharisees that they would change their perspectives about sinners and tax collectors, but because of their pride, they couldn't see their need or the needs of others. Their pride blinded them to God's mercy and grace, and their lack of humility prevented them from coming into God's kingdom. You know, GPS is wonderful these days. My brother-in-law tells a story in his plumbing business about how the big delivery truck called from over the mountain and said, "Oh, I'll be there in an hour." Dale, the kind soul that he is, said, "Which way are you coming?" The truck driver politely said, "Well, I'm following the GPS up over the mountain." Dale said, "I wouldn't come that way if I were you." And the truck driver politely said, "My GPS tells me I should go that way." Dale said, "Okay, I hope it goes well for you. I'll see you tomorrow." At that, the truck driver was a bit curious. He says, "Well, why will it be tomorrow?" Dale says, "Because they closed the road for the snow. The road you were going to travel on your GPS." Truck driver says, I guess I'll drive around the mountain. Sometimes we're not so fortunate. Sometimes our pride and our convictions, like our GPS, steer us down roads that are not good for us. Down roads that are hard to turn around, in spite of how the GPS of our hearts tell us that it's the wrong way. God graciously and mercifully responds to everyone who raises their hand and says, "My GPS isn't working so good. I need a little help." When we think we know more about life than God knows, eventually we find ourselves at a crisis. A crisis we didn't expect. I doubt when this boy took his inheritance and went to live in the big city that he expected to be feeding pigs just to get enough food to survive. A little humility goes a long way. Many a father has bought an unassembled bike or dollhouse or a piece of IKEA furniture and said to himself, "I can put that together without the instructions," only to have his wife or girlfriend say, "Honey, it looks like you should read those directions." And of course, we being the men that we are, say, "I got this." Only to hope that they go to the bathroom so we can steal a glance. The lost son came to a place where his struggles humbled him, and when he went home, he had a far different attitude than when he left. What I've been pondering is that there is abundant mercy and grace available to the humble that the proud won't receive. It's not that they couldn't. It's not that it's not available. It's not that there's not an abundance that wouldn't be poured out. It's that they just don't think they need it. When I kind of look at my own life and think, I don't know where I'd be without mercy and grace for all the foolishness that I have personally participated in. God graciously and mercifully responds to humility. Secondly, and this is a little bit harder to talk about. Secondly, we have all pridefully taken our part of the inheritance and snubbed our nose at the Creator. We have universally taken our material world and snubbed our noses at the God who made it. Now, maybe here in church we have repented and we're thinking differently today, but I guarantee you tomorrow, when you go out to start your car and that guy in front of you is unkind to you, or your car doesn't start or your car has a flat, you'll be thinking more about your material possessions than the God who is designing your world, because you're human like me. We all have pridefully taken our part of the inheritance and said, God, I don't want what you have to offer. At some level, we have all done that. I mean, Romans talks about how we've all sinned. Isaiah talks about how we've all gone astray. We were all kind of part of this human condition. We all look and can see that there's evil around us, and some of it we participate in. Now, we might not do it as bad as the next guy, but it's not that we're innocent. As soon as we discovered we're powerful enough to choose and wise enough to think for ourselves, we embarked on a self-satisfying journey of our wild living and material pursuits. It's the thing we do. It's just regular. It's a result of the fall. All of us do it. Now, granted, your wild might look like my wild, okay? You know, your wild, my wild, and Marcia's wild are different. You know, we could take and stack us up, and we could, say, well, one's more wild. But it doesn't matter what someone else's wild looks like. We've all been the wild kid. We've all gone. Few of us has endlessly embraced an addiction and hooked up with wild men and women until our money ran out. Okay, so we probably didn't do that. But who of us haven't wanted something so badly that we've violated some principle to get it? I mean, who of us? Who of us hasn't wanted something enough that we decided it was worth bending that rule so we could get what we wanted? Who of us has not craved money or power or status so we could stand on our own and say, I did that. I built this world. I built this house. I built that car. I built it whatever. Who of us hasn't wanted to be that guy or gal? Have we all not claimed the American dream as a promised inheritance? Almost as much as to say we need the American dream more than we need the God who provides. We've all centered our hearts at some level on material comfort, and if you think you're not, just look at the inner city and its destitution, or Africa or India, and give up your retirement so that those people can have more. Give up your retirement because you believe there's a greater good that's worth the sacrifice. Christians call it heaven. In the Christian space, Jesus promises to provide for you like he promised to provide for the birds of the air. Can you really trust God with all those things? The sheer fact that you resist my suggestion that you embrace this kind of sacrificial living demonstrates that you, like me, have pridefully taken the inheritance and gone our merry way. In spite of how we say we believe this book is true, we're not apt to trade our earthly inheritance for a heavenly one too soon. We've all taken our Father's inheritance, even me. I get so consumed with money sometimes. I don't know if has anybody ever used Mint? Ever heard of Mint? It's with Intuit. It's a good way to track all your expenses. You link it to your credit cards. It shows you where you charge your money and what happened with your bank that day. And there are some times in my life that I am addicted to looking at my numbers, as if by looking at them I can change them. Okay, when it still says like $50, I don't look at it again and it says like 75. It's like all the same. It's like, but I have this craving to control my material world, and then I get thinking about how I should find other ways to make money, and then I think, well, I could do this or I could do that, and I'm like this entrepreneur like mega factory, and I like churn out ideas. We were driving home in the car, and my wife says, man, you think of more ideas about how to do X, Y, and Z than anybody I know, and it's a curse sometimes. Let me tell you, I struggle with this. It consumes me. And I have a feeling that you have your thing too, that tends to consume you. Some pursuit, some desire, something that if we thought as much about how God promises to be our provider, I would be less anxious about my tomorrow. I would be less like the son who moved away from his father because I thought that if I managed my life better, I could have it all. I kind of wonder if we shouldn't have a third son in the story. I mean, we got the lost son who goes away, comes to his senses and comes back. We've got the good son, well, the other son, who's in the field working hard for dad. I kind of wondered if we didn't need a third son. You know, a third son that goes away for a little while, spends some of his money and comes back to dad, and then lives at home. And then in living at home, now I'm not incriminating any of my children, because I reflect all these things. Because now here's the reason I say that, is because I think that most of us, we don't really see ourselves as the lost son, and we don't really see ourselves as the cranky older brother. In reality, we see ourselves in this nice, safe middle ground where we live at home and then play the wild child. Where we live in the kingdom with one foot, and then we live in the world with the other. And we go, okay, I got my bases covered, and when things get too bad out here, I'll just humble myself and lean in. And when things get a little too tight over here, I'm just going to have to lean on the other side. So I kind of wonder, but Jesus didn't give us a third child option. My question is this: in what ways have we taken our inheritance and ignored God? The human condition is such that we do and continue to struggle with this material world, imagine goods rather than diving into an even more rewarding relationship with Jesus. Perhaps God feels like He's not there because we can't see Him like we see the material goods that we have. But can you see your retirement money? I mean, really, can you see the pile? Can you leaf through the bills? How do you know you have money in an account? You say, I get a statement. How do you know that statement's true? Bernie Madoff made up a lot of statements. Oh, I see someone who feels that pain, okay? How do you know it's true? I mean, at some level, we live in a world where we got to believe something. You can't feel it, smell it, touch the money, but you hope it's going to be there when you get there, when you want it. You know, this picture of how we have, as soon as we see that we have all found ourselves guilty of saying, God, I want my stuff more than I want you. We have a place where we can recognize our humility, and we can turn to the gracious and merciful hand of God who is abundant with his grace. But as long as we don't, as long as we live in a world where we are the materialistic gods and church is a thing we do as a habit, we don't get the good that God promised us in the kingdom, and really, we don't really get the good that the world promises you either. In what ways have you taken your inheritance and ignored the God who's given you so many things? So thirdly, we frequently criticize, judge, or worse, condemn people who get what we don't think they deserve. Now, when we look at the story and we read the older brother, we have like this cynic in us that says, why is he being so mean-spirited? But I think if we were really honest, what we're really saying is, we think he should be punished too. We think that there's no way in hell that child should be let back in my Father's house without paying his due for all the headache and trouble he caused when he took his money and ran for the city. That's what we really think. And we don't just think it in the context of the parable. We think it every time somebody who we don't think deserves it gets the break. And it doesn't matter if you're in church or if you're in a business world. It doesn't matter if you attend church or you don't. If you're in a space and somebody gets a gift or an approval or a promotion or a certificate or something, and you think they didn't deserve it, what do you do inside? Do you go, attaboy? So nice that you got that? Inside, do you well up with pride because they have been so successful? Or inside, do you well up with this condemning judgment that says, man, I can't believe they got that promotion? As big of a louse as they are at work, and they come late all the time, and they take long lunches, and they smoke in the bathroom, and they're not even supposed to do that. I mean, the issue isn't that we have all been guilty of taking our stuff and going away from God. We are all bitter at people who get what we think they don't deserve, as if we are good judges. Like if I judge people, if I get judged by the judgment I judge other people, man, am I in trouble or what? I have a feeling I'm in a room with people that sympathize with my challenge. It's universal. All of us gripe when someone gets what we don't think they deserve. Our hearts are filled with a lack of grace and mercy when the undeserving get breaks. And so we feel justified with our anger at how they receive something that they didn't deserve. In our hearts, we criticize people just like the Pharisees. Fourthly, God responds to humility with extravagant grace. See, I think this is what really burned the older brother. It wasn't just that the brother came home, even though that was probably irritating too. It wasn't just that the father embraced the younger brother. It wasn't just that he made a place for him in the servant quarters so he could have food to eat. The issue was that the father extravagantly seemed to ignore all the history that boy created. It wouldn't have been so bad if it would have been a little reward. But it was full go back to the old position before you left reward. I mean, look at it. Verse 21. The son said, Father, I know I have sinned against heaven and against you, and no longer worthy to be called your son. And 22 says, but the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Bring the ring and put it on his finger, the sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast to celebrate. Those are all acts of extreme generosity. And the older brother is screaming, why are you so generous with him? Don't you see what he deserves? And the father says, how can I not? I have this heart that loves him. And I love his humility. And I love his humility so much that I just want to give so graciously, and I want to clean the parts of him that are broken in the past. And I want to give him a new start. He doesn't do it minimalistically. He does it extravagantly. And those who realize their need, who struggle along, who find Jesus, when they trade in their foolish living, they find abundant living, extravagant reception. And Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, stop being a complainer and recognize that the kingdom is open for all who come humbly. Because we have all taken our goods and stuck our nose up at the Creator. We have all bellyached, like you are right now, at people who don't deserve. We're all guilty. And yet, see, this is just the miraculous part of it, and yet, God graciously gives with abandon. Foolish abandon. Heidi didn't mean it. It was an honest mistake. I had spent $100 on the guitar. It was a nice guitar. It had nice stuff and played well. And I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but she dropped it on its face like this. And when it fell, I heard this nifty crack sound. You know, the crack sound that suggests that something irreparable had just happened. And when I picked it up, sure enough, there was a crack in the neck that came down the neck about 2 frets. And then all of the back here was all, you know, you crack a piece of wood and it leaves all the splinters everywhere. And it was one of those slow motion things. Like, we were sitting in the living room and she was playing it, and she got up, and I think that the strap, sometimes the strap gets turned funny on the hooks. And sometimes when you pick it up, it will do funny things. And so she was getting up, and when she leaned, she had the bottom, terrible. And she looked over at me with these eyes that said, "Oh my word, what is going on?" And I looked, and I was like, okay, well, it's all right, Heidi. You didn't mean to do it. And that was that. She thought that she deserved something. She didn't mean to do it. It was completely an accident. It was one of those things. Everybody has things that are regrets. Maybe she deserved to be punished. Should I have yelled at her? Should I have taught her the lesson about how you ought to be more careful with other people's stuff? I mean, I drove all the way to the other side of Durham to get that guitar, and I paid him $100 cash money. And it was like 10 years ago when $100 was more than $100 is now. Okay, it was, I mean, should I have really made a fuss about how you need to be more responsible and take care of other people's stuff, and how if you'd have been more careful this wouldn't have happened, and just jammed it down? I did enough of that in other ways that was not helpful for my child. What she really needed is she needed to know how extravagantly I loved her, and that you couldn't break a guitar and lose my favor. And see, I think that that's what Jesus was trying to get across to the Pharisees. See, the Pharisees said, if you live up to our expectations, you get our approval. And what Jesus said is, there is no way you will live up to my expectations. But if you come humbly and acknowledge that I don't live up to those expectations, I will abundantly give you approval that is far beyond what the Pharisees offer you. And yet we persist to live in a world where the Pharisees' rules define us. Instead of this world where God says, I will abundantly, graciously give you. Not stingy, minimalistic grace, but something extravagant. There are a few words around which I feel like this story really pivots. One of those is in verse 17, where it says, when he came to his senses. See, I think that word senses is a huge pivot. We can spend a lot of time living in a material-focused world as if God doesn't exist and doesn't matter. And we can have all kinds of crises, but until we come to our senses and we realize that there is a spiritual world, and that spiritual world does make a difference in everyday life, we cannot discover the God who wants to be gracious to us. We can't discover it we can't just go figure it out. Like, we've got to come to our senses where in our humility we go, well, I don't have enough answers to my whys to really solve it. I think another turn there is the series of phrases in verse 22. Bring the best robe, the ring, the sandals, the calf. As a sign of readoption. You know, God made us all. He made the Pharisees. They're just people. They're just guys. They're just men. They're just women. They're just regular people. Now they think they're something, but God made everybody. And we all went our own way. We continue to go our own way. It's a cycle. God is leading us into repentance, and the more we live in repentance, the more we humble ourselves, the more we seek God's face, the more He becomes visible. The more He becomes visible, the more we trust Him. I mean, we're all on the journey. But those things that He does for His Son there, that those are extraordinary. I don't deserve that. And yet God says, I want to do it. And then the very last part, that idea of come to His senses, and then God's extreme generosity. And then this very last part, we had to celebrate, verse 32, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost, and he's found. You know, all of us have been lost. Some of us continue to keep getting a little bit lost along the way. The celebration in heaven is for people that have seen how God generously celebrates those who are found. This Father's Day, you as a father have an opportunity to share with your children and your spouse about how God the Father has abundantly loved you and how you can abundantly love them in spite of what they've done. And so if you have a child that you have been estranged from, that you have intentionally held at a distance because you want them to suffer. I felt like that. This is the day to say, I have been received with abundance in spite of myself. Pick up the phone and call and say, I'm sorry, I was so proud and I held out. You know, as dads, we have such influence in our kids' lives. sometimes it's not about what the kid does. It's really only about what I do. And what the Father did for me, I can do for others once I've received it. As we close today, this Father's Day, Baby Dedication Day, the moral of the story is it doesn't matter what kind of dad you had. Once you begin to learn about Jesus and see how his Father, God the Father, loves you in your chaos, in your struggle, in your trouble, and how he invites you to spend a little time remembering when you came to your senses, how he turns you to a new direction, and how you notice that Jesus was inviting you to come closer, that you too can know that you are part of the family, that you've been brought into the home. Feel his welcome and share some warm bread and fresh jam. Isn't that what we all want? That's what Jesus wants for everyone who's lost. Father, I am asking that you would affirm your love as our Father. That you would fill us with wonder at how, in spite of our ways of living, you have generously offered yourself on our behalf. How you search for lost things, lost people. You search for them. Lord, you've been searching for us. Lord, we humble ourselves and say, please teach me, show me the way. Lead me back to my Father's house. If you want to come and pray today, you may. If you want someone to pray with you, please sit on the front seats. And if you want someone to anoint you with oil for a health issue, there's some in the back, and Mr. Keith is back there, and he'll talk with you, I'm sure. And we'll sing together.